wind howling off the Boston harbor in February of 1849 did not just chill the skin. It seemed to seek out the marrow of a man's bones. It tasted of salt, coal smoke, and the rusted iron of a city that had grown too fast and too cold. Elias Thorne pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his chest, ducking his head against the biting gust as he turned onto State Street. The gas lamps were flickering into life, casting long, wavering shadows against the brick facades of the counting houses. To anyone passing by, Elias was just another shadow in a city of gray men, a clerk with ink-stained fingers and a posture bent by years of punching over ledgers that belonged to men wealthier than he would ever be. But inside Elias, a clock was ticking. A clock that had started 3 days ago when Mr. Sterling, the bank's relentless debt collector, had paid a visit to the small, drafty boarding house Elias shared with his wife, Sarah. 3 weeks, Mr. Thorne, Sterling had said, his voice as dry as parchment. The bank is not a charity. 3 weeks to settle your father's debts, or we take the house. And considering the market, we might take your freedom, too. Debtor's prison is unpleasant in the winter. $500. He might as well have asked for the moon. Elias pushed open the heavy oak door of the post office, grateful for the momentary reprieve from the wind. The air inside smelled of dry paper and wet wool. He wasn't expecting anything. He never was. But checking the post had become a grim ritual, a way to delay the inevitable return to a home where the empty cupboard screamed of his failure. The postmaster, a man named Henderson with spectacles perched precariously on a bulbous nose, looked up. He squinted, then frowned. "Thorne?" Henderson asked, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Yes," Elias replied, his voice raspy. "Something came," Henderson said, sounding surprised. He turned to the wooden slots behind him and pulled out an envelope. It was not a normal letter. It was battered, stained with water and grease, and smelled faintly of pine resin and something metallic. The paper was thick, rough-hewn parchment, not the refined stationery of Boston, but it was the handwriting that made Elias's breath itch in his throat. It was scrawled, frantic and erratic, but undeniable. It was addressed to Elias Thorne, Boston, Massachusetts, and no return address. Just a heavy smudge of red wax sealing the back, imprinted with the thumb of a man. "Where is this from?" Elias whispered, taking it. The letter felt heavy, heavier than paper should feel. Henderson shrugged. "Ship arrived this morning from the Isthmus of Panama. Before that, God knows. Looks like it traveled through hell to get here." Elias didn't wait. He tore the seal. As he unfolded the parchment, a small shower of grit fell onto the counter. Henderson leaned in, his eyes widening. "Is that—" The postmaster trailed off. Elias brushed the grit with his thumb. It wasn't sand. It shimmered with a dull, seductive luster under the gaslight. Gold. Pure raw dust. He quickly folded the paper, hiding the dust, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He nodded curtly to Henderson and rushed back out into the cold. He didn't feel the wind anymore. He felt only the heat of the letter burning a hole in his pocket. The apartment on the second floor of the tenement was dim, lit only by a single tallow candle that Sarah had nursed to save money. She was sitting by the window, mending a shirt that had been mended 3 times before. When Elias burst in, she looked up, alarm evident in her pale, tired eyes. "Elias, is it Sterling again?" Elias locked the door and bolted it. He moved to the table, sweeping aside the meager dinner plates. "Silas," he breathed. Sarah froze. "Your brother?" "Elias, Silas has been dead for 2 years. Everyone says so." They were wrong. Elias threw the letter onto the table. He carefully shook it, allowing the remaining grains of gold dust to sparkle on the dark wood. Sarah gasped. her hand flying to her mouth. "Read it," Elias commanded softly. He pulled the candle closer. The ink was smudged in places, written with a haste that bordered on madness. "Dear brother, if you are reading this, I am still alive, though there are nights in the Sierra Nevada where I question that fact. I know you think I abandoned you to father's debts. I know you think I ran. I did run, Elias. I ran until the ocean stopped me. And then I ran further. I am in Sacramento Valley. They call it the New Helvetia, but that is a polite name. It is a madhouse. But Elias, the stories are true. It is not just in the rivers. It is in the roots of the grass. It is in the mud on your boots. A man can pull a fortune from the earth if he has the grit for it. Enclosed is a sample. Just a morning's work. There's a claim, Elias. Up the American River, past the mill. I found something. Not just placer dust. A vein. A motherlode. But I cannot hold it alone. The vultures are circling. Men with eyes like sharks. I need someone I can trust. I need my blood. Sell everything. Buy passage to Shager's. Cross the jungle to Panama City. And take the steamer to San Francisco. Do not come overland. The winter will kill you before the Indians do. Bring a gun. Trust no one in San Francisco. Meet me at the Hanging Tree Tavern in Sacramento City on the 1st of June. If I am not there, ask for One-Eyed Jack. But tell him nothing of the vein. Come, brother. We will live like kings, or we will die trying. But we will not die poor. Silas. Silence stretched in the room, heavy and suffocating. Sarah touched the gold dust with a trembling finger. "Is it real?" she whispered. "It's real," Elias said. He looked at the letter. Silas was always a dreamer, a gambler, but he never lied about money. If he says he found a vein, he found a vein. Sarah looked up at him. "The trip costs a fortune, Elias. A fortune we don't have." "We have the house," Elias said, his voice hardening. "The bank owns the house." "The bank owns the mortgage," Elias corrected. "We have equity. If I sell the deed to a private buyer tonight, undercut the market, I can get enough for a steerage ticket and supplies. I can pay off enough of Father's debt to keep Sterling away from you for a year." Sarah stood up, her face flushed. "You're talking about leaving me? To chase a ghost across the world? Elias, people die on that trip. Cholera, yellow fever, shipwrecks. And what happens if I stay?" Elias snapped, frustration of 3 years breaking through. He gestured to the cold room, the empty pantry. "We starve, Sarah. Sterling throws us on the street in 3 weeks. I rot in a debtor's cell while you wash clothes for pennies. Is that the life we promised each other?" Sarah flinched as if slapped. She sank back into the chair, tears welling in her eyes. Elias knelt beside her, taking her rough, cold hands in his. "Look at this gold, Sarah. This is just dust. If Silas is right, 1 month of work could buy this entire building. 1 year, and we could buy a farm in the valley. A real life. No smoke, no Sterling, no hunger." He squeezed her hands. "I have to go. It's the only hand we have left to play." Sarah looked into his eyes, searching for the hesitation she usually found there. But tonight, she saw something else. She saw the reflection of the gold dust, and behind it, a desperate, terrifying hope. "The 1st of June," she whispered. "I'll be there." Elias vowed. The next 3 days were a blur of frenzied activity that felt more like a funeral preparation than an adventure. Elias sold the furniture. He sold his father's pocket watch. He sold the few books he cherished. Finally, he met with a shady land speculator in a tavern near the wharves and signed over the deed to their small home for half its value. It was robbery, but it was cash. He paid Sterling the minimum to keep the wolves at bay for 12 months. He gave the rest to Sarah, sewing the banknotes into the lining of her bodice. "If I am not back in a year," he told her, standing on the mist-shrouded dock of Boston Harbor, "you take this money and you go to your sister in Vermont. You forget me." "Don't you dare," Sarah said, her voice fierce, grabbing the lapels of his new, sturdy canvas coat. "You come back. Rich or poor, Elias Thorne, you come back to me." He kissed her, a desperate, searing kiss that tasted of salt tears. Then he turned away, shouldering his heavy pack. The ship was the Argus, a converted merchant brig that looked too small to cross a pond, let alone two oceans. The deck was swarming with men, hundreds of them. They were called Argonauts, men like him, drawn by the siren song of the West. They wore wool coats and flat caps. They carried pickaxes and shovels strapped to their backs like weapons of war. There were lawyers standing next to blacksmiths, farmers rubbing elbows with criminals. In Boston, class separated them. Here, on the gangplank, they were all equal in their desperate greed. Elias showed his ticket to the purser. "Steerage," the man grunted, pointing down into the dark, foul-smelling belly of the ship. Elias descended the ladder. The air below was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and fear. He found a narrow bunk, barely a coffin's width, and threw his pack down. Next to him, a giant of a man with a thick red beard was sharpening a Bowie knife. He looked up at Elias and grinned, revealing a gap where a front tooth should be. "First time leaving home, lad?" the giant asked. "Yes," Elias said, checking his pocket to ensure Silas's letter was still there. It crinkled against his chest, a physical reminder of why he was here. "Where you headed?" "Sacramento," Elias said. The giant laughed, a booming sound that shook the timbers. "Ain't we all? They say the nuggets are big as goose eggs, just lying there for the taking." "I'm looking for my brother," Elias added quietly. The giant's expression sobered slightly. "Family, eh? Good. A man needs someone to watch his back out there. The gold country ain't no place for a lone wolf. It's a place where civilization goes to die." Above them, the ship's bell clanged. The Argus lurched as the mooring lines were cast off. A cheer went up from the deck above, roar of excitement and bravado. But down in the dark, Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He pulled the letter out one last time. He read the warning again. Trust no one. He looked at the friendly giant with a knife, then at the other man eyeing his boots, his pack, his coat. Silas was right. The Boston Elias Thorne, the polite clerk, the honest husband, could not survive this journey. He would have to become someone else. As the ship began to roll with the Atlantic swells, moving away from the safety of the harbor and into the open, gray expanse of the ocean, Elias folded the letter away. He whispered into the darkness, "I'm coming, Silas." The journey to the Golden State had begun, and the man who stepped off the boat in California would not be the same man who had just boarded it. The letter from Sacramento had promised gold, but as the city of Boston faded into the mist behind him, Elias realized it had also promised something far more dangerous, reckoning. The first thing Elias noticed wasn't the city itself, but the skeletons. As the Oregon threaded its way through the Golden Gate and into the bay, a silence fell over the passengers. Before them lay a maritime graveyard. Hundreds of ships, barks, brigs, schooners, and whalers floated listlessly in the harbor. Their sails were furled or rotting, their decks empty, their masts rising like a scorched forest against the fog-laden sky. "Forest of masts," Red murmured, standing beside Elias at the rail. Crews jumped ship. Captains, too. Everyone ran for the hills. It was a ghost fleet, a testament to a madness that had depopulated the seas, to populate the mines. But as the Oregon dropped anchor, the silence shattered. A swarm of small boats surrounded them, manned by shouting watermen charging exorbitant fees to ferry passengers to the shore. Elias and Red, their faces still streaked with the stubborn coal dust of the boiler room, stepped onto the muddy shoreline of Yerba Buena Cove. The ground beneath their feet was not solid earth. It was a slurry of trash, crates, tobacco spit, and the trampled dreams of 10,000 men. San Francisco was not a city. It was a hallucination constructed of canvas and greed. Tents built over the hills like dirty snow. Wooden shacks stood precariously on pilings. The streets were rivers of mud, so deep the mule was rumored to have drowned in the middle of Montgomery Street. "Watch your pockets," Red warned, his hand drifting near the knife at his belt. The crowd was a dizzying mosaic of humanity. There were Chileans in colorful ponchos, Chinese men with long braided queues and blue tunics, Kanakas from the Sandwich Islands, and rough-looking Australians known as Sydney Ducks. They made their way toward Portsmouth Square, the beating heart of the bedlam. The noise was a physical assault, the clinking of gold scales, the manic piano music from the gambling hells, the auctioneers shouting over crates of brandy and boots. "We need supplies," Elias said, his voice tight, "and we need a way up the river to Sacramento." They entered a general store that was little more than a canvas roof over a mud floor. The prices scrawled on a chalkboard made Elias gasp. Eggs, $10 a dozen. Flour, $50 a sack. Shovel, $20. Robbery, Red grunted. Supply and demand, the shopkeeper said without looking up. He was weighing gold dust on a brass scale, the grains piling up like sand. "You buying or staring? Space costs money." Elias purchased dried beef, coffee, and a small tin of percussion caps for the pistol Red had insisted he buy in Panama. He paid with the last of his Boston money, feeling the lightness of his pockets. "One more thing," Elias said, leaning on the counter. "I'm looking for news of a man, Silas Thorne. He would have come through here a few months back." The shopkeeper paused. He looked at Elias, really looked at him for the first time. His eyes narrowed. "Thorne, you his kin?" "His brother." The shopkeeper snorted, a sound devoid of humor. "You favor him?" Same stubborn jaw. "Yeah, I remember Silas. Came through here in January. Bought 3 picks and enough whiskey to kill a horse. Paid in dust. Good dust. Have you seen him since?" "No," the man said, returning to his scales. "But others have been asking. Men you don't want to know." Elias felt a cold prickle on his neck. "Who?" "The hounds." The shopkeeper lowered his voice. "Regulators, or so they call themselves. Ex-soldiers from New York, mostly. They run the tents down by Little Chile. They came in asking about a man named Thorne who found a vein. They didn't look like they wanted to trade recipes." He pushed Elias's goods across the counter. "If you're going to Sacramento, boy, you better grow eyes in the back of your head. Your brother has drawn attention. The wrong kind." Night fell over San Francisco like a heavy curtain, but the city did not sleep. It only grew louder. The Parker House Hotel and Saloon was a beacon of yellow light in the fog. Elias and Red pushed through the swinging doors. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke and the metallic tang of fear and excitement. Monte dealers slapped cards onto felt tables, and miners with dirt under their fingernails bet pouches of gold dust that represented months of labor. They found a corner table. Elias watched the room, his nerves strung tight. The shopkeeper's warning echoed in his mind. "The hounds. We leave at first light," Elias said quietly. "There's a schooner running up the delta." "If we can afford it," Red noted, eyeing a plate of roast bear meat a waiter was carrying. Suddenly, the noise at the bar died down. The crowd parted. 3 men walked in. They wore military surplus jackets with brass buttons, but their demeanor was anything but disciplined. They moved with the swagger of predators. The leader, a man with a scar slicing through his left eyebrow and a silk cravat that looked stolen, scanned the room. His eyes stopped on Elias. The resemblance to Silas must have been stronger than Elias realized. The man nudged his companion, whispered something, and they began to move toward the corner table. "Red," Elias warned, his hand moving to the Colt revolver tucked in his belt. "That's him," Red said, calmly cutting a piece of hard cheese he had bought earlier. The leader stopped at their table. He smelled of cheap rum and expensive pomade. "You look lost, friend," the man said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "Not lost," Elias said, meeting his gaze. "Just passing through." "Passing through to where? The American River?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We have a friend up there. Silas. You wouldn't happen to know him." "Never heard of him," Elias lied. The man chuckled. He placed a hand on the table, leaning in. "That's funny, because you're wearing his face. Listen to me, Pilgrim. Your brother owes something to the organization. A map, a location. He thought he could slip away, disappear into the canyons." The man's hand dropped to the hilt of a Bowie knife on his hip. "We heard he's gone missing. Maybe dead. If he is, the debt falls to the next of kin." Elias stood up. He wasn't the clerk from Boston anymore. He was the man who had shoveled coal in hell. "If he's dead," Elias said coldly, "then he took his secrets to the grave. And if he's alive, he can handle the likes of you." The leader's smile vanished. Rave words for a clerk. He lunged. It happened in a blur. The man went for his knife, but Red was faster. The giant kicked the table over, slamming it into the leader's midsection. The man doubled over, gasping. The other 2 thugs reached for their pistols, but Elias had his Colt drawn. He didn't aim. He just fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Bang! The room froze. The piano stopped. The dealers held their cards in midair. In San Francisco, a gunshot was as common as a cough, but it still commanded attention. "Back off," Elias shouted, the gun shaking slightly in his hand, but his aim true. "We're leaving." The leader scrambled back, clutching his ribs, his face twisted in rage. "You can't run, Thorne. The trail is long. We'll find you in the canyon." Red grabbed Elias by the collar. "Go. Now." They backed out of the saloon, weapons raised, stepping into the cool, foggy night. They didn't stop running until they reached the wharves. They found a river sloop, the Annabelle, preparing to cast off for the tide. The captain, a grumbling old salt, took their last few dollars for deck passage. As the sloop drifted away from the dock, the lights of San Francisco flickered in the distance, like dying embers. Elias sat on a coil of rope, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the pistol in his hand. It smelled of sulfur. "You all right?" Red asked, watching the shoreline recede. "They know," Elias whispered. "They know about the vein. Silas wasn't just hiding from debts. He was hiding from them." "Well," Red spat into the dark water, "now they know we're coming too." "Do you think they hurt him?" Elias asked, the thought finally voicing itself. Red didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the moon, pale and distant through the fog. If Silas found what he said he found, men would kill their own mothers for it. But if he's anything like you, Elias, he's hard to kill. Elias nodded, holstering the gun. The city of dust and dreams was behind them now. Ahead lay the river, the mountains, and the truth. He pulled his coat tighter. The letter in his pocket felt heavier than ever. It was no longer just a map to gold. It was a death warrant. To Sacramento, Elias said. To the gold, Red replied. The sloop caught the wind, surging forward into the blackness of the delta, carrying them toward the veins of promise and the river of sweat. Located at the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers, it was the jumping-off point for the northern mines. If San Francisco was the gateway, Sacramento was the funnel. Thousands of men, mules, and wagons were crammed into a grid of dusty streets lined with canvas tents and hastily erected wooden facades. The air smelled of horse manure, sawdust, and the frantic energy of men who believed they were days away from becoming millionaires. Elias and Red stepped off the river sloop, their boots sinking into the pulverized dust. The heat was different here than in Panama, dry, searing, and relentless. It dried the sweat on their skin before it could drip. The hanging tree, Elias said, shielding his eyes against the glare. Silas said to meet him there. They found it easily enough. It was a massive valley oak, its gnarled branches spreading wide over the street, casting a dark, welcome shadow. Beneath it sat a rough-hewn tavern, little more than planks on barrels, serving whiskey that looked like kerosene. The barman was a gruff figure with a patch over his left eye and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. One-eyed Jack. Elias approached the bar, Red flanking him like a bodyguard. Whiskey, Elias said, sliding a coin across the wood. Jack poured 2 shots without a word. I'm looking for Silas Thorne, Elias said, keeping his voice low. Jack's single eye flicked to Elias, then to Red, then back to Elias. He didn't blink. He wiped the counter with a rag that was greasier than the wood. A lot of men looking for Silas. Jack grunted. Some friends, some not. I'm his brother. Jack paused. He leaned in, studying Elias's face. You got the jaw, and the eyes. He said you might come. Said you were a clerk. I was, Elias said, his voice hard. Now I'm here. Jack reached under the bar and pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped packet. He slid it across the counter, covering it with his large hand. He ain't here, Jack murmured. He went upriver 3 weeks ago. Said he was going back to the claim to secure it, but he left this. Said if he didn't come back by June 1st, I was to give it to his kin. Elias felt a cold knot in his stomach. Did he say anything else? Yeah, Jack said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He said the hills have eyes. Watch your back, Boston. The hounds are sniffing around. They were here yesterday asking about him. Elias took the packet. Inside was a crude map drawn on buckskin and a single, heavy nugget of gold, rough, jagged, and beautiful. Let's go, Red said, eyeing the crowded street nervously. They needed a team. 2 men alone in the Sierra Nevada were vulnerable, and mining, as Elias quickly learned from the chatter in the streets, was not a solitary profession. It required a company. They found their first recruit near the horse market. A group of rowdy miners was shoving the smaller man back and forth, jeering at him. Go back home, greaser, one man shouted. Foreigners pay $20 a month tax. You got $20. The man being shoved was wiry, with skin the color of polished walnut and hair black as a raven's wing. He held his ground, his dark eyes flashing with defiance, but he was outnumbered. I was mining this river before you knew where California was on a map. The man spat back in perfect, accented English. One of the miners raised a fist. Hey! The shout came from Red. The giant stepped forward, his shadow engulfing the aggressors. He rested his hand on the hilt of his Bowie knife. Leave him be, Red rumbled. The miners looked at Red's size, then at Elias, who stood with his hand near his colt. They grumbled, spat in the dust, and dispersed. The man straightened his poncho and dusted himself off. He looked at Elias and read with a mix of gratitude and wariness. "I am Mateo," he said, "from Sonora." Elias replied, "and this is Red. You know the river, Mateo." "I know the river. I know the rock. I know how the gold hides," Mateo said. "But Mexican alone out there, it is dangerous." "We're heading up the North Fork," Elias said. "We have a claim. We need a man who knows what he's doing. Equal shares." Mateo's eyes widened. "Equal shares? Americans usually offer me wages. Slave wages. We aren't those Americans," Elias said. By noon, they had their fourth member, an older man named Tobias, Old Mose Abernathy, a former trapper who had been in the mountains since the days of the fur trade. He looked like a biblical prophet, long white beard, leathery skin, and missing two fingers on his left hand. He came with a mule named Bessie and a cynicism that was as deep as the canyons. "Gold," Mose scoffed, spitting tobacco juice. "Root of all evil. But it buys whiskey and warm blankets. I'm in." The journey up the American River was a ascent into a world of violent beauty. They left the flat, oppressive heat of the valley and climbed into the foothills. The landscape changed to rolling hills of golden grass, dotted with gnarled oaks and gray pines. Higher up, the air grew thinner and sweeter, smelling of pine resin and crushed sage. But the beauty hid the brutality of the work ahead. The map Silas had left was specific, but difficult. It didn't lead to the main bars where thousands of men were already shoulder to shoulder, washing gravel. It led into a narrow, steep-walled canyon, a tributary that cut through the slate rock like a knife wound. Silas picked a hard spot. Mateo observed, studying the canyon walls. Steep, dangerous, but the geology, it is good. Quartz and slate. That is where the gold gets trapped. They reached the claim on the fourth day. It was a secluded bend in the creek, shadowed by towering pines. There was signs of a previous camp, a burnt-out fire ring, a broken shovel handle. "Silas was here," Elias whispered, touching the charred wood. "Where are you, brother?" There was no body, no note, just the silence of the mountains and the roar of the water. "We work," Elias commanded, pushing down his dread. "We find the gold. We find Silas." The romance of the gold rush died in the first hour of labor. Mining was not an adventure. It was an act of physical punishment. They built a long tom, a wooden trough about 12 feet long with a perforated sheet of iron at the end, using the timber from the surrounding woods. The process was a relentless cycle of agony. Red and Elias dug the gravel from the creek bed. The water was snow melt, freezing cold, numbing their legs within minutes. They shoveled the heavy, wet muck into the long tom. Mateo stood at the trough, pouring water over the gravel, breaking up the clay with a hoe. Old Mose worked the end, watching the riffles, wooden slats meant to catch the heavy gold as the lighter dirt washed away. "More water," Mateo would shout. "More dirt." Mose would yell back. Elias's hands, already scarred from the coal shoveling, began to bleed again. His back ached with a constant, throbbing fire. The sun beat down into the canyon, trapping the heat, while the water froze his feet. It was a paradox of fire and ice. For 3 days, they found nothing. Just black sand and fool's gold. Iron pyrite that shimmered mockingly in the pan. Maybe he lied. Red grunted on the third night, rubbing liniment into his shoulders by the fire. Maybe Silas was crazy. "The geology is right," Mateo insisted, though he looked exhausted. "The color is there. We just haven't hit the bedrock." "Bedrock," Elias murmured, staring into the flames. "That's where Silas said it was. In the roots of the grass, deep in the cracks." Day 5 brought the breaking point. Elias was in the pit, waist deep in water. He swung his pick at a large boulder that was blocking their progress. The pick struck sparks, the vibration jarring his bones. He swung again, and again. Rage took over, rage at Sterling, at the dead, at the silence of the canyon, at the missing brother. Clang. The boulder shifted. Red, give me a hand. Elias yelled. Together, straining until the veins in their necks bulged, they pried the massive stone loose and rolled it downstream. Beneath the boulder lay a layer of hard-packed blue clay, sitting directly on top of the slate bedrock. Blue clay, Mateo said, scrambling down the bank. His voice trembled. That is the ancient riverbed. They filled a single bucket with the blue clay. It was heavy, sticky stuff. They took it to the Long Tom. They washed it carefully, breaking apart the clumps. The muddy water flowed away. Old Mose stopped the water flow. He leaned over the riffle box. Well, I'll be damned, the old trapper whispered. Elias crowded in. There, caught in the wooden slats, was not just dust. There were flakes. Heavy, flat flakes the size of pumpkin seeds. And among them, nestled like eggs in a nest, were 3 nuggets, rough and jagged, glowing with a dull, buttery luster that was unmistakable. Color, Red breathed. Real color. Mateo quickly scooped the concentrate into a pan and swirled it. The black sand washed away, leaving a crescent of pure gold at the bottom. 4 ounces, Mateo estimated, his eyes gleaming. Maybe 5, in one bucket. 5 ounces, at $16 an ounce, that was $80. A clerk in Boston made that in 2 months. They had made it in 10 minutes. A cheer erupted from them, a raw, primal sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Red grabbed Elias in a bear hug that nearly cracked his ribs. Old Mose did a jig, his bad leg forgotten. But Elias didn't dance. He reached into the pan and picked up the largest nugget. It was cold and heavy. He held it up to the sun. This was it, the vein of promise. But as he looked at the gold, he saw a shadow move on the ridge high above them. Just a flicker of movement among the pines. He blinked, and it was gone. Elias, Red asked, seeing his expression. We found it, Elias said quietly, his grip tightening on the nugget until the edges bit into his palm. But now we have to keep it. He looked at his companions, sweaty, muddy, bleeding, and ecstatic. The river of sweat had paid off. But as the sun dipped below the canyon rim, casting the claim into premature twilight, Elias remembered the shopkeeper's warning. The vultures are circling. They had the gold. Now the war would begin. Gold has a sound. It is not the metallic clink of coins, nor the soft thud of a heavy bar. In the wild, gold has a silence. It is a heavy, suffocating silence that drowns out the birds, the wind, and eventually, of a man's own conscience. For 2 weeks, the canyon had been generous. The vein of promise was not a lie. The blue clay yielded ounce after ounce of the precious metal. They filled coffee tins, then leather pouches, and finally, they began filling the spare socks Elias had brought from Boston. They were rich. In 14 days, they had pulled roughly $20,000 worth of gold from the earth. In 1849, that was enough to buy a fleet of ships or a county of farmland. But they were also prisoners. Elias stood by the Long Tom, his rifle leaning against the wooden trough. He wasn't looking at the gravel anymore. He was watching the rim of the canyon. The towering pines, once majestic, now looked like the bars of a cell. The steep slate walls that hid the gold also blocked their escape. You're spooking the mule, Elias, Old Mose said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the stream. The old trapper was calm, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the brush. Someone was up there again last night, Elias said, his voice raspy from fatigue. I heard a rock fall. Mateo heard it too. Mateo, who was downstream panning the tailings, looked up. He nodded gravely. Not a deer. A deer steps with care. This was a boot. A heavy boot. The hounds, Red grunted, swinging his pickaxe with a violence that suggested he was imagining a man skull beneath it. If they're here, why don't they attack? Why wait? Because we're doing the digging for them, Elias realized, a cold chill settling in his gut. Why break their backs swinging picks when they can wait for us to clean out the pocket, then come in and take it all? That afternoon, the shadow became solid. Elias had moved up the creek, away from the noise of the Long Tom, ostensibly to scout for firewood, but truly to clear his head. He found himself near a twisted manzanita bush, its red bark peeling like sunburned skin. Something caught his eye, a slash on the trunk of a pine tree. It wasn't a natural mark. It was a blaze, cut with a knife, but it was old, the sap having hardened over the wound. Elias stepped closer. Below the blaze, half buried in the pine needles, was a flat stone that looked out of place. He knelt and pried the stone up. Underneath lay a rusted tobacco tin. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He recognized the tin. It was a blend of Virginia tobacco his father had smoked. Silas had taken the last tin when he left Boston. With trembling fingers, Elias pried the lid open. Inside was not tobacco, a scrap of paper torn from a ledger, wrapped around a small, heavy object. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Silas's, but it was jagged, written in the dark or in pain. They are close, the captain and his dogs. I can't hold the claim. I hid the main cache in the cave behind a waterfall, but they know I'm here. If you find this, Elias, turn back. The gold is cursed. It brings only blood. They are not men. They are devils. S. Elias unwrapped the object inside the paper. It was a locket. Sarah's locket. He had given it to Silas to sell in case of emergencies. A last resort to buy passage home. Silas had never sold it. He had kept it. A twig snapped behind him. Elias spun around, his hand flying to the Colt in his belt. Standing 20 yards away, leaning casually against a boulder, was a man. He wasn't one of the rough miners Elias had seen in the valley. He wore a dusty long coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a pair of fine leather gloves. It was the man from the Parker House Saloon in San Francisco, the leader of the hounds. "Sentimental, isn't it?" the man said, his voice smooth and carrying easily over the sound of the water. Elias drew his pistol, leveling it at the man's chest. "Don't move." The man smiled. He didn't raise his hands. "Relax, Mr. Thorne. If I wanted you dead, my sharpshooter on the ridge would have put a ball through your head before you even touched that tin." Elias glanced up at the canyon rim. He saw nothing, but he felt the weight of unseen eyes. "Who are you?" Elias demanded. "Captain Vance," the man replied, tipping his hat. "And you are trespassing on my claim." "Your claim?" Elias laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "We filed the papers in Sacramento. This is Thorne land." "Thorne land," Vance mused, stepping closer. "Yes, Silas thought so too. He was a stubborn man, your brother. Had a lot of fight in him. More than you, I suspect." Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. "Where is he?" Vance sighed as if bored. "He ran, like a rabbit. We caught him near the pass. We tried to be reasonable. We asked for the location of the vein. He wouldn't talk. So, we let the mountains have him." "You killed him," Elias whispered. "The elements killed him," Vance corrected. "We just removed his supplies. And his boots. Hard to survive Sierra winter without boots." Rage, hot and blinding, flooded Elias's vision. He wanted to fire. He wanted to empty the cylinder into Vance's chest. but he knew the sniper was watching. If he shot Vance, he would be dead a second later. "What do you want?" Elias asked through gritted teeth. "I want what is mine," Vance said, his voice hardening. "You boys have done a fine job. 2 weeks of hard labor. You've saved my men a lot of sweat. Here's the deal, Thorne. You leave the gold. All of it. You keep your lives. You walk out of this canyon. Go back to Boston and tell your wife you failed, but you'll be alive. And if we refuse..." Vance's smile vanished. His eyes were like chips of flint. "Then tonight, when the moon goes down, we come. And we won't just take the gold. We'll take your scalps for trophies. You have until sundown." Vance turned his back on the gun, a display of supreme arrogance, and walked into the trees. "Sundown, Thorne," he called back. Tick-tock. Elias ran back to the camp. Red, Mateo, and old Mose were already armed. They had seen the movement on the ridge. "It's Vance," Elias said, breathless. "The hounds. They're here." "How many?" Red asked, checking the percussion caps on his rifle. "I saw one, but he claims to have a sniper, and there are likely more in the woods. 10, 12, enough to surround us. He gave us terms." Mateo asked, "Leave the gold, leave with our lives, or die?" Olmo spat. "Liar. He'll kill us either way. Men like that don't leave witnesses, especially not witnesses who can identify them to the law in Sacramento." "He admitted to killing Silas," Elias said, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a cold resolve he hadn't known he possessed. "He showed them the locket. He left him to freeze to death." Red looked at the locket, then at the heavy pouches of gold stacked by the tent. He looked at Elias. "We ain't running, are we?" Red asked softly. "No," Elias said. "We aren't running." He looked at the canyon walls. It was a trap, yes, but a trap could also be a fortress. "Mateo," Elias said, pointing to the map Silas had drawn. "This cave behind the waterfall, is it defensible?" Mateo studied the terrain. "The waterfall, yes. The entrance is narrow. The rock is thick. They cannot shoot us from the ridges. They would have to come through the water to get to us." "A choke point," Red nodded. "Like Thermopylae." "We move the gold," Elias ordered. "Now, we take everything to the cave. We set up a killing field. If they want this gold, they're gonna have to pay for it in blood." The sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows into the canyon. The beauty of the Sierra Nevada turned menacing. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. They worked frantically, hauling the heavy sacks of gold and their supplies behind the curtain of the waterfall. The cave was damp and loud, the roar of the water echoing off the stone, but it was solid. It was a bunker. Elias took the last position outside, covering their retreat. He held the tin box with Silas's letter in his pocket. The sun touched the horizon. The light turned golden, then blood red, then gray. "Sundown," Elias whispered. Crack! A bullet struck the rock inches from his face, sending stone splinters into his cheek. The sound of the rifle shot rolled down the canyon a split second later. "They're coming." Red roared from the cave mouth. Elias dove behind a boulder as a hail of gunfire erupted from the tree line. The peaceful canyon shattered into chaos. Bullets whined off the slate and splashed into the creek. From the darkening woods, dark shapes emerged. Men in dusters moving methodically, firing as they advanced. The hounds. Elias returned fire, his Colt bucking in his hand. He saw a man stumble and fall into the brush. "Back. Fall back to the cave." Elias shouted. He scrambled over the slippery rocks, the waterfall thundering beside him. He could see Vance in the distance, standing tall, directing his men like a conductor of an orchestra of death. Elias reached the cave entrance. Red grabbed his arm and hauled him inside. The world narrowed to the dark mouth of the cave and the shimmering curtain of water in front of them. They were cornered. They were outnumbered. But they were armed and they were angry. "Let them come," Old Mose said, leveling his long buffalo rifle on a rock. "I got enough powder for all of them." Elias wiped the blood from his cheek. He touched the locket in his pocket. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't about the dead anymore. It wasn't about the house in Boston. It was about Silas. "Hold your fire until they hit the water," Elias commanded, his voice steady over the roar of the falls. "Make every shot count." Outside, the shadows lengthened. The hounds were closing in. The judgment of gunpowder was about to begin. The cave was a mouth of wet stone, swallowing the roar of the waterfall and spitting it back as a deafening, continuous thunder. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of ozone, damp moss, and the acrid, metallic tang of fear. Elias crouched behind a stalagmite, his knuckles white around the grip of his Colt. Beside him, Red was checking the load in his shotgun, his face a mask of grim concentration. Mateo was further back, huddled over the kegs of black blasting powder they had used to break the rock. Old Mose lay prone near the entrance. His buffalo rifle rested on a flat stone. The barrel pointed at the shimmering curtain of water that separated them from the world, and from death. "They're waiting," Red shouted over the noise of the falls. "Waiting for the moon to drop. Waiting for our eyes to get heavy." "They won't wait long," Elias replied, his voice echoing strangely in the cavern. "Vance is arrogant. He wants us over so he can drink our whiskey." As if on cue, a shadow darkened the water. Crack! Moses' rifle spat a tongue of orange fire. The heavy .50 caliber ball punched through the water. A scream, swiftly drowned by the river, followed. "That's one," Mose muttered, reloading with practiced, fluid motions. "But there's a dozen more." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The hounds opened up with everything they had. Bullets shredded the water curtain, turning the spray into a deadly mist. Lead slammed into the cave walls, whining as it ricocheted off the slate. Stone splinters flew like shrapnel. Elias flinched as a chip of rock sliced his ear. "Keep your heads down." They were pinned. The hounds were firing blindly, but the volume of fire was suppressing them. Under the cover of the barrage, Elias knew Vance's men were moving closer, creeping through the creek bed, using the boulders for cover. "We can't hold them off forever." Mateo yelled, crawling forward. "They are flanking the sides. Once they get to the rocks on the left, they have a clear angle." Elias looked at the kegs of powder. They had 3 barrels of DuPont blasting powder, enough to bring down a mountainside. "The powder," Elias said, his eyes locking with Mateo's. "You want to blow the entrance?" Mateo asked, eyes wide. "We could trap ourselves inside." "No," Elias said, his mind racing with a cold, clerk-like precision. He wasn't calculating interest rates anymore. He was calculating trajectory and blast radius. "We don't blow the cave. We blow the creek." He pointed to the narrow, rocky shelf just outside the waterfall, where the hounds would have to step to storm the cave. "We roll a keg out," Elias explained rapidly. "Rig a short fuse. When they rush, we light it and kick it through the water." Red grinned, a feral expression in the gloom. "A welcome mat." "It is dangerous," Mateo said, already prying the lid off a keg to insert a fuse. "If they shoot the keg while it is next to us, then we don't have to worry about the dead anymore," Elias said grimly. The shooting outside stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. It was the inhalation before the scream. "Get ready," Mose whispered. "Here they come." Shadows multiplied behind the water. Not one or two, but a wave. Vance was sending them all. He wanted to overwhelm the few defenders with sheer mass. Light it, Elias screamed. Mateo struck a lucifer match against the rock. The sulfur flared blue, then caught the short fuse. It hissed like a snake. Red grabbed the heavy keg. With a roar of effort, he hurled it. The keg flew through the waterfall, splashing onto the rocky shelf outside, just as the first shapes of men began to emerge through the spray. Elias, Red, and Mateo dove flat against the cave floor, covering their heads. Old Mose, slower than the rest, was still turning when the world ended. Boom. The explosion was not a sound. It was a physical blow. It sucked the air out of the cave and then slammed it back in with the force of a hammer. The ground heaved. The waterfall was momentarily blasted backward, the water turning into a cloud of white vapor. The shock wave threw Elias against the wall. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out all thought. Dust and smoke filled the cave, choking them. Elias coughed, struggling to his knees. Red, Mateo, I'm here. Red groaned, pushing a pile of rubble off his legs. Mose, there was no answer. Elias crawled toward the entrance. Old Mose lay on his side, a jagged piece of slate, dislodged from the ceiling by the blast, was embedded in his chest. The old trapper's eyes were open, staring at the roof of the cave, seeing a sky that wasn't there. Mose, Elias scrambled to him, but one look told him it was too late. The old man was gone. Grief flared, hot and sharp, but Elias shoved it down. There would be time for mourning later. Now there was only the judgment. Elias grabbed his Colt. He grabbed Moses' Bowie knife. He stepped through the smoke, through the dissipating steam, and out of the cave. The scene outside was a portrait of hell. The explosion had devastated the hounds. The rocky shelf was shattered. Bodies lay scattered in the creek, broken and still. The water ran red, swirling around the debris. Moans of the dying filled the air. Men were crawling away, weapons lost. Their fight completely broken by the shock of the blast. But one man was standing, Captain Vance. He had been further back, behind a boulder, protected from the main blast. But he wasn't unscathed. His coat was shredded, his face blackened with soot, and blood trickled from his nose. He swayed slightly, holding a heavy dragoon pistol in his hand. Elias stepped into the creek, the water rushing around his boots. The sun had set, and the canyon was bathed in the gray light of dusk. Vance looked up. His eyes were wide, the arrogance finally replaced by shock. He looked at the carnage around him, then at Elias. "You," Vance rasped. "You're just a clerk." "I was," Elias said. He walked forward, the gun at his side. He didn't raise it. He wanted Vance to see him, to see Silas in his face. Vance raised his pistol. His hand shook. Elias didn't flinch. He walked steadily. Vance fired. The bullet whizzed past Elias' shoulder, tearing through his shirt, but missing flesh. Vance had rushed the shot. Panic. Elias stopped 10 paces from him. "That was for the dead," Elias said softly. Vance cocked a hammer for a second shot. Elias raised the Colt. He didn't aim for the chest. He aimed for the knee. Bang! Vance screamed as his leg buckled. He fell into the icy water, the pistol splashing out of his reach. He thrashed, clutching his shattered knee. Elias closed the distance. He stood over the leader of the hounds. Vance looked up, water and blood streaming down his face. His eyes filled with terror. "Mercy," Vance gasped. "I can pay you. I have gold. More gold than you can imagine." "You took his boots," Elias said. His voice was devoid of emotion. It was the voice of the mountains now. You let him freeze. It was business. Vance pleaded. Just business. This is business too, Elias said. He holstered the gun. He drew the heavy Bowie knife he had taken from Moses' body. The blade caught the last light of the day. No, Vance whimpered, scrabbling backwards in the mud. No, please. Silas sends his regards, Elias whispered. He didn't strike out of anger. He didn't strike out of hate. He struck because it was necessary. Because in the lawless dark of 1849, there were no judges, no juries, and no jails. There was only the gun, the knife, and the will to survive. Elias drove the knife down. Silence returned to the canyon. The roar of the waterfall seemed to reclaim the space, washing away the screams. Elias stood there for a long time, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his hands. They were covered in blood. Vance's blood, Moses' blood, his own. Red and Mateo emerged from the cave. They saw the bodies. They saw Elias standing in the creek. They didn't say a word. They understood. The man who had walked into the water was not the same man who stood there now. The clerk from Boston had died in that cave, buried under the same rock that killed Mose. The survivor turned to face them. His eyes were old. "Bury Mose," Elias said, his voice cracking slightly. "Bury him by the river." He liked the sound of it. "And Vance," Red asked, gesturing to the body drifting against a rock. Elias looked at the corpse of his enemy. "Leave him," Elias said. "Let the vultures have him." He said they were circling. "It's only right we feed them." The moon began to rise over the ridge, casting a pale, ghostly light over the gold country. The battle was won. The gold was safe. But as Elias looked at the gleaming yellow moon, he realized that the hardest part wasn't fighting for the gold. It was living with what he had done to keep it. The judgment of gunpowder had been rendered, and they were all guilty. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It only brought clarity. And in the harsh light of day, the canyon looked less like a treasure chest and more like an abattoir. The creek, usually clear as gin, ran turbid and brown, stained by the mud of the explosion and the blood of the fallen. Vultures, the undertakers of the sky, were already circling, black specks against the azure blue, waiting for the living to leave so they could begin their work. Elias stood knee-deep in the loose soil on the bank, a shovel in his hands. His hands were raw, the blisters from the coal room now reopened and weeping, but he felt no pain. He felt a numbness that went deeper than the skin. Beside him, Red and Mateo dug in silence. They were digging a grave. Not for the hounds, let the coyotes have them, but for old Mose. They wrapped the trapper in his favorite buffalo robe, the one he claimed he'd traded a gallon of whiskey for in '33. They placed him in a hole, facing east, toward the rising sun and the mountains he had loved more than people. He didn't have any kin, Red said, his voice thick. He stood by the open grave, holding his hat in his massive hands. Said his wife died of the pox in St. Louis 10 years back. Said the mountains were his family now. He was a good man, Mateo murmured, making the sign of the cross. He saved us. Elias looked down at the old man's face, now peaceful, the grime washed away by the rain of the waterfall. Mose had died for a dream that wasn't even his. He had died for Elias's debt and Silas's ghost. Dust to dust, Elias whispered, tossing the first shovel of dirt. It was a heavy sound, the earth hitting the body. It was the sound of a finality that no amount of gold could bribe. After the burial, they returned to the cave. The gold was still there. The sacks were piled against the wall, heavy and silent. The explosion had scattered some of the loose dust, coating the floor in a glittering sheen. But the bulk of the fortune, the nuggets, the flakes, the vein, was intact. Elias stared at it. It looked different now. Yesterday, it had looked like salvation. It had looked like a house in Boston, a silk dress for Sarah, a farm with green pastures. Today, it looked like metal. Just cold, heavy, yellow metal. He picked up a pouch. It weighed perhaps 5 pounds. $80 an ounce. $1,000 in his hand. A fortune. It feels heavy, Mateo said, sitting on a keg of powder, nursing a wrapped bandage on his arm where a bullet had grazed him. It's blood money now, Elias said, dropping the pouch. It landed with a dull thud. Red kicked at a loose rock. Don't go getting philosophical on us, Elias. Mose knew the risks. We all did. That gold there, that's freedom. That's what Mose died for. If we leave it, we'll mope over it. Then he died for nothing. Elias looked at Red. The giant was right in his way. To despise the prize was to insult the sacrifice. But the taste of victory was like ash in his mouth. We aren't leaving yet, Elias said. What? Red frowned. Vance is dead. The hounds are broken. We take the mules, we load the gold, and we get the hell out of this canyon before more of them show up. Not yet, Elias repeated. He turned to look up at the high ridge, where the snow line began. Vance said they caught Silas near the pass. He said they took his boots. Red sighed, scrubbing his face with his hand. Elias, he's gone. You know he's gone. I know, Elias said softly, but I promised Sarah I'd bring him home. If I can't bring him home walking, I'll bring him home to be buried. I won't leave him to the wolves. Red looked at Mateo. Mateo nodded slowly. A man should rest with his people. I will stay here, guard the gold. You go. Red spat. Fine, but we make it quick. This place, the air feels wrong now. The climb to the pass was brutal. They left the pine forest behind and entered a world of granite and scrub brush. The air grew thin and cold. The wind howled through the crags, carrying the scent of snow and ancient ice. Elias walked with a singular purpose. He scanned the ground, looking for signs. A scrap of cloth, a broken branch, anything. They found the campsite 2 hours later. It was a small, pathetic shelter built against a rock overhang. The ashes of a fire were long cold, blown away by the wind. A tin cup lay rusted in the dirt, and there, 50 yards away, in a depression in the snow, was a shape. It wasn't a skeleton, not yet. The cold of the High Sierra had preserved him. He was curled into a ball, knees to chest, as if trying to hold on to the last heat of his life. Elias stopped. His breath hitched in his throat. He walked forward slowly, the snow crunching under Pembroke's boots, the boots he had taken from a dead man to survive. The irony hit him like a physical blow. Silas had died because his boots were taken. Elias had lived because he took boots. He knelt beside the body. It was Silas. His face was gaunt, bearded, and blue with the cold, but it was him. His eyes were closed. He looked almost peaceful, as if he were just sleeping. But his feet were bare, blackened by frostbite. "Oh, Silas," Elias whispered, his voice breaking. He reached out and touched his brother's shoulder. It was hard as stone. Red stood a few paces back, giving him space. The wind whistled through the rocks, a mournful dirge. Elias saw the tattered remains of Silas's shirt. He saw the bruises on his wrists where he had been bound. Vance hadn't just left him. He had tied him and left him. It was a slow, cruel execution. Tears, hot and stinging, finally spilled over Elias's cheeks. He wept for the brother who had carried him on his shoulders when they were children. He wept for the dreamer who had come west to save their family. He wept for the waste of it all. He found something in Silas's stiffened hand. He pried the fingers open gently. It was a small piece of quartz, laced with gold. Even in the end, freezing to death, Silas had held onto the dream. He never gave up, Elias said, wiping his eyes. No, Red said softly. He didn't. They couldn't carry the body down. It was too far, and the terrain was too steep. We bury him here, Elias decided, where he can see the valley, where he can see the gold country he loved so much. They built a cairn of stones over the body, heavy granite rocks that no wolf could move. It took hours. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet. Elias took the locket, Sarah's locket, which he had recovered from the tin box, and wedged it into the stones. You rest now, brother, Elias whispered, placing his hand on the cold rocks. The debt is paid. The family is safe. You did it. You saved us. It was a lie, of course. The gold had saved them, but the gold had also killed him. But it was a lie Silas deserved to hear. The descent back to the canyon was silent. When they reached the camp, night had fallen. Mateo had a fire going. He looked at their faces and asked no questions. He simply handed Elias a cup of coffee. We leave at dawn, Elias said, staring into the fire. The gold, Mateo asked. Pack it, Elias said. All of it. They spent the night loading the mules. The heavy sacks of gold dust and nuggets were strapped onto Bessie and the 2 other mules they had captured from the hounds. It was a staggering amount of wealth, roughly 80 pounds of gold. In Boston, men would kill for a single ounce. Here it was just luggage. As the first gray light of dawn touched the peaks, Elias took a torch from the fire. He walked to the wooden sluice boxes, the long tom they had built with such labor. He walked to the canvas tents where they had slept. He walked to the pile of supplies they couldn't carry. What are you doing? Red asked. Cleaning up, Elias said. He tossed the torch onto the canvas tent. The dry fabric caught instantly. The flames roared up, orange and hungry. He threw another brand onto the long tom. The wood, dried by the sun, crackled and burned. Why? Mateo asked, watching the camp turn into an inferno. So no one else comes here, Elias said, the flames reflecting in his eyes. This place is a graveyard. I want the forest to take it back. I want the ashes to cover the blood. He didn't want to leave a monument to their greed. He wanted to leave a scar that would heal. They stood and watched the fire consume their temporary home. The heat was intense, pushing them back. The smoke rose up, a black pillar against the morning sky, carrying with it the smell of burnt canvas and the memories of the last month. Elias turned his back on the fire. He looked at the loaded mules, at the fresh grave of old mows by the river, and then toward the west, toward San Francisco, toward the ocean, toward home. Let's go, Elias said. He took the lead rope of the lead mule. He didn't look back at the burning camp. He didn't look back at the canyon walls. They walked out of the shadows and into the blinding light of the valley. They were leaving as rich men, wealthier than they had ever dared to dream. But as Elias walked, he felt the weight of the boots on his feet, Pembroke's boots. He felt the phantom weight of the locket he had left on the mountain. He felt the absence of Mose and Silas. He realized then that the gold wasn't the treasure. The treasure was the fact that he was still breathing, and the price of that breath had been everything else. They had crossed the continent, survived the jungle, fought the hounds, and conquered the mountain. They had won the game. But as the smoke from their burning camp faded into the distance, Elias knew that the gold would never be enough to buy back the pieces of his soul he had left in that canyon. The ashes of greed were all that remained behind them. Ahead lay the golden legacy, and the long, hard road of living with it. San Francisco had changed. In the few months Elias had been in the mountains, the canvas tent city had begun to petrify into wood and brick. The madness was still there, the gambling halls, the mud, the frantic commerce, but there was a new permanence to it. The city was no longer just a campsite. It was becoming a metropolis of the Pacific. Elias, Red, and Mateo walked into the offices of Burgoyne and Company, one of the few reputable banking houses in the city. They looked like apparitions. Their clothes were stained with the red dust of the Sierra. Their boots were worn to the cobbles, and they carried the smell of wood smoke and old blood. But the clerks didn't sneer. They saw the heavy canvas sacks slung over the men's shoulders. In San Francisco, a man's hygiene was irrelevant. His burden was everything. "We'd like to make a deposit," Elias said, his voice raspy. He dropped the first sack onto the mahogany counter. It landed with a thud that shook the inkwells. The banker, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, opened the sack. He stared at the contents, jagged nuggets, heavy flakes, and fine dust that shimmered like captured sunlight. "We need Wade," Elias said, "and we need drafts drawn on a bank in Boston and Mexico City." It took 3 hours to weigh and to say the haul. The final tally was staggering. After the split, removing the share for supplies and the taxes levied by the chaos of the time, each man walked away with roughly $7,000. In 1849, a clerk in Boston earned $400 a year. A good farm cost $500. They were not just rich, they were tycoons. But as they stood outside the bank, blinking in the foggy afternoon light, the celebration was muted. "Well," Red said, hitching his thumbs into his belt. He looked uncomfortable in the city now, like a bear trapped in a parlor. "I reckon this is it." "What will you do, Red?" Elias asked. Red looked up at the skeletal frame of a new hotel being built up the street. "I ain't going back east. There's nothing there for me but snow and memories I don't want. I think I'll buy a plot here. Maybe build a saloon. A place where a man can get an honest drink without being gouged. I'll call it the Miner's Rest." He grinned, the old spark returning to his eyes. "You boys are welcome to drink for free. Forever." Mateo adjusted his sombrero. He held a bank draft that would make him a king in Sonora. "I go home. I buy back my father's land. I plant corn and agave. I will never touch a pickaxe again." He embraced Elias, a firm, brotherly grip. "You are a good man, Elias. You have the heart of a jaguar. Do not let the city tame you again." "I won't," Elias promised. Red clapped a massive hand on Elias' shoulder. "Give him hell in Boston, lad. And if you ever get tired of the tea and the taxes, you know where to find me." They parted ways at the intersection of Clay and Montgomery. Elias watched them go, Red disappearing into the crowd of the gambling district, Mateo heading toward the docks. He was alone again, but he wasn't the same man who had arrived here. He touched the breast pocket of his new coat, where the bank draft sat next to the pistol. He turned toward the harbor. The Panama steamer was leaving in the morning. The journey home was a blur of gray oceans and steam. Elias didn't travel in steerage this time. He had a cabin. He ate at the captain's table. He wore a suit of fine wool, but he found he couldn't sleep in a soft bed. At night, he would lie on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the creak of the ship, dreaming of the roar of the American River and the crack of a rifle. He saw Silas in his dreams, not the frozen corpse on the mountain, but the brother he remembered, laughing, dealing cards, eyes full of mischief. "We will not die poor," Silas had written. "We didn't," Elias whispered to the dark cabin, "but we paid a high price." Boston was freezing when he arrived in November. The wind off the harbor was just as biting as it had been 9 months ago, but it no longer chilled Elias. After the Sierra winters, this was nothing. The city felt small. The buildings, which had once seemed towering, now looked cramped and gray. The people walked with their heads down, scurrying like ants. They looked soft, Elias walked straight to the financial district. He didn't go home first. He had one piece of business to finish. He entered the offices of Sterling and Associates. The clerk at the front desk looked up, nose wrinkling at Elias's weathered face, despite the fine suit. "I'm here to see Mr. Sterling," Elias said. "Do you have an appointment?" "Tell him Elias Thorne is here. Tell him I'm here for the house." Moments later, Elias was ushered into the plush office. Mr. Sterling sat behind his massive oak desk, looking exactly the same, dried out, pinched, and predatory. "Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, not rising, "I must say, I am surprised to see you. I assumed you had succumbed to the elements, or the savages. Disappointed?" Elias asked, sitting down without being offered a chair. Sterling smirked. "It makes no difference. The deadline on your father's debt is next month. I assume you are here to beg for an extension? I'm afraid the bank is not in the business of charity." Elias reached into his coat. He pulled out a leather pouch, not a bank draft, but a pouch of raw dust he had kept for this specific moment. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed heavily, knocking over a crystal inkwell. Black ink spilled across Sterling's ledger. "What is this?" Sterling sputtered, standing up. "Gold," Elias said calmly. "Unrefined, 22-carat Sierra gold. That's 5 pounds. At current market rates, it's worth $1,200. That covers the debt, the interest, and the mortgage on the house." Sterling stared at the pouch, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He looked at Elias, really seeing him for the first time. He saw the scar on his cheek from the rock splinter. He saw the calluses on his hands. He saw the eyes that had watched men die and had killed men to survive. Sterling shrank back into his chair. The power dynamic in the room had shifted violently. I will have to have this assayed," Sterling stammered. "Do it," Elias said, standing up, "and send the deed to my wife by noon tomorrow. If it's 1 minute late, Mr. Sterling, I will come back, and I won't be as polite." He turned and walked out, leaving the ink dripping onto the floor and the gold sitting like a judgment on the desk. The walk to the tenement house was the longest mile of his life. He climbed the stairs, the familiar creak of the wood sounding like music. He stood before the door. He took a breath, smoothing his coat, trying to compose the face of the husband Sarah remembered. He knocked. "Who is it?" Her voice, tired, wary. "It's me," Elias said. The lock clicked. The door opened. Sarah stood there. She looked thinner, her face pale, her hands red from washing clothes. She stared at him, her eyes widening. She looked at his suit, his face, his eyes. "Elias," she whispered. "I'm back, Sarah," he said. She didn't ask about the gold. She didn't ask about the house. She threw her arms around his neck and buried her face in his chest, sobbing. Elias held her, closing his eyes, smelling the lavender soap she always used. This was the real gold. This was the only thing that mattered. Later that night, by the warmth of a fire he had built with coal he could now easily afford, he told her. He told her about the jungle, the river, the claim. He told her about Red and Mateo and old Mose. And then he took her hands. "Silas?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You found it, Sarah," Elias said gently. "He found the vein. He saved us." "Where is he?" "He's in the mountains." Elias lied, or perhaps told a partial truth. He decided to stay. He found peace there, Sarah. He rests high up, overlooking the valley. He's happy. Sarah looked at him, searching his face. She saw the grief there, deep and buried. She understood. She squeezed his hand and nodded. She wouldn't ask again. "And us?" she asked. "We have the money now. We can stay here." You can buy a partnership in a firm. Elias looked around the small room. He looked at the window, where the gray brick wall of the next building blocked the view. No, Elias said. I can't go back to Allegra, Sarah. I can't sit in a room and count other men's money. He pulled a map from his pocket. It wasn't a map of gold claims. It was a map of the fertile valleys of California, the Napa and Sonoma valleys, where the sun shone golden on the vines and the earth was rich and black. The gold rush will end, Elias said, tracing the map. The mines will dry up. The river will be empty. But the land is the future. I want to build something real, something that grows. I want to go back, Sarah, not for the gold, but to live. Sarah looked at the map, then at her husband. She saw the fire in him, not the desperate fire of debt, but the steady flame of purpose. It's a long way, she said softly. I know the way. Elias smiled, a genuine smile this time. And I have the best boots for the journey. Epilogue 1870. The sun was setting over the Thorne vineyard in Sonoma Valley. The rows of vines stretched out in perfect symmetry, heavy with purple grapes glowing in the amber light. Elias sat on the porch of the large, white farmhouse. His hair was completely gray now, and he walked with a slight limp. A reminder of the damp caves and the cold rivers. A rider approached up the long, dusty drive. It was a young man, dressed in rough mining clothes, looking dusty and desperate. He rode up to the porch and tipped his hat. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said. "I'm heading north, to the Trinity River. Heard there's a new strike up there. You got any water?" Elias stood up and poured a glass of lemonade from a pitcher. He handed it to the boy. The boy drank greedily. "You been to the mine, sir?" the boy asked, wiping his mouth. "You look like a man who's seen the elephant." Elias looked at his hands, scarred and weathered, resting on the porch railing. He looked out at his fields, where his children were playing tag in the twilight. He looked at Sarah, who was in the garden cutting roses. "I was there," Elias said softly, "in 49. Did you find it?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with the eternal greed of the frontier. "Did you find the gold?" Elias looked at the boy, seeing the same desperation he had once felt. He smiled, but it was a sad, knowing smile. "I found enough to know that gold is just a rock, son," Elias said. "The real treasure is being able to sleep at night, and having a place to wake up." The boy looked confused. He handed the glass back. "Well, thanks for the water. I'm gonna be rich. You just watch." "Good luck," Elias said. "Watch your back in the canyons." The boy rode off, chasing the sunset, chasing the ghost that had nearly consumed Elias. Elias watched him go until the dust settled. Then he turned and walked back into his home, leaving the Gilded Frontier behind him, content with the legacy he had built, not from the gold he had taken from the earth, but from the life he had planted in it.